Good evening from Asia Society Hong Kong, and I'm Alice Gong, Executive Director of Asia Society Hong Kong Center. I'm delighted that those of you are joining us. It is evening here in Hong Kong, and we're going to have three incredible speakers. One of them in Hong Kong, one in Singapore, and one in Germany. So please, thank you for joining us for tonight's topic, Cross-Compass Idealism and Realism from West to East. And we have three wonderful scholars. And I was just thinking about how to introduce them. I'm actually quite intimidated by all of them. I pride myself on being a good student and doing my homework on them. Their resume, their CV are quite incredible. So we're really, really delighted that during this time of COVID, that we can bring you thoughtful academics and leaders, and to talk about things that are actually quite important. And I think during this time of reflection, I know here in Hong Kong, it's been kind of dreary. It's been cold, and then we're witnessing the fourth wave of the COVID pandemic. And I know globally, everybody is having lockdown measures. So those of you, and thank you for joining us tonight. So I'm going to get started by introducing our incredible speakers tonight, and then get the discussion going with our moderator, Professor Wang Gungwu from Chairperson of Philosophy Department at CUHK, Chinese University of Hong Kong. First off, Professor Susan Neiman. She is an American moral philosopher, cultural commentator, essayist, and director of the Einstein Forum in Potsdam. Professor Neiman is born in Atlanta, Georgia, and she has studied philosophy at Harvard University and the Free University of Berlin, and was a professor of philosophy at Yale and Tel Aviv University. And she's the author of Slow Fire, Jewish Notes from Berlin, and the Unity of Reason, rereading Kant, and so some really wonderful books. And we're really delighted that she's joining us from Europe tonight. Professor Wang Gungwu, he is a historian of, and he's the former governing board chairman of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. And Professor Wang is no stranger to Hong Kong, having been associated with Hong Kong Youth for many years. And Professor Wang studied history in the University of Malaya and holds a PhD from School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. And he was a founding member of the University Socialist Club and its president in 1953. Professor Wang was awarded the academic prize of the Fukuoka Asian Culture Prize by the Japanese city in 1994. And he was awarded the Tang Prize in Sinology and Distinguished Service Order for Singapore in 2020. And we're delighted Professor Wang can join us tonight from Singapore. And Professor Wang Gungwu, who is currently professor and chairperson of Philosophy Department at CUHK, and he served as president of Association of Chinese Philosophers in America. And we're delighted that Professor Huang will be moderating tonight's discussion. So I'm going to hand it over. I think we're going to have to get Professor Neiman started on a panel discussion, and later on, Professor Huang will will moderate. So Professor Neiman.
I'm sorry, I understood in the letter I got yesterday, I see you want me to talk about realism, and okay, sorry. So look, we hear very often the claim when anyone proposes something hopeful, be realistic. And that can actually be translated as the statement, reduce your expectations. The world will disappoint you. Don't try. This is actually a quite cynical and environment. You have no chance of changing anything. That is my translation of the very, very common claim, be realistic. that you hear, in the most ordinary situations, but certainly in important political discussions. I turn to Immanuel Kant, the great and philosopher of the Enlightenment. I know, by the way, that Kant is getting a bad rap as at the moment, at least in certain Western circles, as somebody who made a couple of racist statements. But since I'm talking to people in Hong Kong and Singapore, I would like to point out that Kant made the sharpest critique of colonialism I've ever read in the 18th century, and congratulated the Chinese and the Japanese for refusing to allow, at least for a time, colonial interventions. And that is worth saying. But Kant said, look, ideas have a different kind of reality than actual things have, but they're equally important. Take the idea of justice and look how far it has gotten us. It has not gotten us far enough, but I'll, give you two examples in my own lifetime. I was born in the American South in the middle of the civil rights movement. We never would have in our wildest dreams imagined that we would have a Black president in our lifetime. And of course, racism towards President Obama was the real cause for the backlash, which brought the current man who's refusing to leave the White House. But nevertheless, the fact that an African-American president was twice elected and, without any scandal, with dignity and intelligence, with all of his family in that house lived, is an example of a set of ideas, namely the ideas of the civil rights movement, that were realized because thousands of people worked to realize them. It's also the case that when I was a girl, the assumption that women could have a family and a serious career as well was not really something that anybody believed in. My own daughters today, who are about to turn 30, they're twins, have a very different view of perspectives of what their life possibilities are. They take it for granted, and so does my son, interestingly. Those are just two examples in my own lifetime of ideas that have actually changed the world. And what I urge us to do, and I find this is something that is metaphysically grounded in Kant's work, to be a grown-up idealist, as I call it, means always to keep one eye on the way the world is and one eye on the way the world ought to be. And it's quite a difficult thing to balance, right? It's much easier, either to ignore reality and become some kind of a fanatic, or to say, all of the things that you say about how the world ought to be better are pipe dreams, and we might as well forget them and kick back and have another drink, throw up our hands. But keeping, we have two eyes for a reason, I like to say, keeping one eye on the way the world ought to be and one eye on the way the world is the only way to be adult and to make some progress in human affairs. How's that for an introduction? I can say more. I can go on once you get me started for a long time, but maybe that's enough for an introduction.
Very good, very good. So, Professor Wang, you can.
Well, that certainly gives us a very good start. I think you defined it much more clearly than normally find in discursive or polemic studies on ideals and realism. I think if I may use the Chinese example as a contrast to the Kantian philosophical inquiry, the Chinese had certain ideals, certainly. The ideals are couched in different terms. I would say the most durable set of ideas that the Chinese have had for thousands of years is that morality is a source of good, and societies, people, families, states, all should observe moral behavior, moral ideals, and these are and set out. There are many schools of thought about this. Confucius, of course, is the most famous of all of them to emphasize this morality. But your idea that you have keep an eye on the reality was always there, because Confucius, for all his tremendous efforts on trying to get people to have a sense of morality, was certainly very realistic. I mean, he was always out to serve the state. He never withdrew, as it were. He never said, I have certain ideals. If I can't achieve it, I either fight for it or I just withdraw and become a hermit. He never did that. What he did was to go out and try and persuade people to be good, continually to do that, either through education or through giving advice to rulers. Very frustrating job. He never really succeeded in convincing any ruler to be moral the way he wanted them to be. But he never gave up. He just did it all the time. He never succeeded, but he never gave up. So that you can say that's an ideal. But he was always realistic about how far he could go. That's why no ruler actually cut his head off. They listened to him and ignored him or argued with him, but they never killed him. They never punished him for anything. So that's his realism. So you can say that was a practical example of your one eye on one and one eye on the other. That part is fine. But nevertheless, in the real world, as outside of the world of ideas, how people behaved was certainly much more like realists. And within the Confucian school itself, eventually produced one group of people who said that morality is not enough. You need laws. You need to punish people for doing wrong. Just telling him to be good is not good enough. You got to punish him if he does wrong. So you developed the idea of the legalists. And of course, they served the state in a different way. They believed that the only way is to have a powerful state, to have strong laws, very fierce, brutal laws, to deter people from doing bad things, and ultimately to serve the state, to enable the state to be really powerful. And that powerful state, when you're idealistic about it, that powerful state can do good things because it has the power to do good things. I mean, that's the other side of it. But what actually happened in real life was that once the legalists got into power and then failed, and they failed, and the Han Dynasty came in, they eventually brought back the Confucians to say, these laws are too harsh. They are all this emphasis upon punishment, all that part has alienated the people against the state. So they brought in the Confucians, who then brought back to advise the emperors how to be good, how to be moral, how to their people, and how to show that they care, be fatherly, as it almost patriarchal about their people, and thus win the people to listen to him. And of course, if he failed, then the people had the right to throw that emperor out. So you had the right of rebellion was built into at least a real disciple of Confucius mentions. It was moral, it was an ideal. If you're a bad ruler, you should be thrown out. If you're a good ruler, we should respect you. Well, this is putting it in very simple terms. But at least the ideal was that if you are bad, we have the right, and somehow heaven is on our side to throw you out and give you a new mandate to a new guy who will come and do the right things. So that part of it ends up with something which is much more cynical, as you would say, and that is that there's ends and means. And the ends and means part may sound a little bit like your Machiavelli and so on, but it isn't quite as simple as that. The ends, of course, is to be a good state, a successful ruler, a moral ruler, and so on. But if you are not good, the means can be violent, can be totally immoral, in fact, to get rid of you, because you're such a bad ruler. People are prepared to go to all ends. any means, and the end justifies the means to throw you out. And peasant rebellions, all kinds of rebellions, even foreign conquest, even bringing in foreigners to come and help you get rid of your ruler is justified, because that is moral. Now that's the past. What happened is that your Enlightenment ideas came to China as something from outside. And there are no roots in the Chinese. But many of the ideas that your philosophers that came out of the 18th century and end up with Kant and so on, there are no Chinese roots to those ideas. But the Chinese did have some ideas about the individual, about rights, and so as contrast to duties. They also had certain metaphysical ideas coming from Buddhism from India, which they imported. Now, the reason they imported, again, was very practical. The Chinese themselves were not strong and not particularly interested in metaphysics and theoretical ideas. They had it, but they didn't pay much attention to it. But when Buddhism came in and brought them this in a systematic way, introduced them to these transcendental ideas and so on, the Chinese found that it filled a gap in their lives, in their spiritual lives, and they adopted it. So they actually were willing to take from outside something that would fill a gap in the Chinese sphere, as it were. But when the West came, after the Jesuits and down to the 19th and 20th century, they found that there was not that much that they really wanted to learn from the West. But they did agree about one thing, that all those Confucian ideals mixed up with legalism and so on had run its course. There was no use for China. It failed utterly. It could not cope with the new brilliant ideas from the West. So they were willing to reject the whole thing, all the traditions. In the May 4th movement, which we've all appreciate, they simply said, chuck the thing out. We start again, we're prepared to take all from the West. And at the height of the idealism of the young people in the May 4th movement, they concentrated on what they call science and democracy. As it were, distilled all the Western wisdom into two things. I mean, it's big bundles of all sorts of ideas, but science on the one hand as being absolutely necessary to become modern and progressive and strong and wealthy, everything related to being scientific. And on the other side, democratic, because these are the people who have been left out of politics, totally ignored, no participation whatsoever, simply cared for in a patriarchal way, or patronizing way by the elites, the mandarins and so on, but never had any say whatsoever in the running and the governing of the state. Oxford was to say, it is time for the people to have a say in how we are governed. So the two ideas, as it would boil down to these two, really excited people. And you see a generation of idealists that China had not seen for a very long time, or very rarely saw in the whole of the 2,000 years of the after unification of China. Very rarely put in such terms. But the excitement of the 20th century in the May 4th movement was absolutely unbelievable. A young generation was prepared to throw baby out with the bathwater and start afresh. But in the course of doing that, they found that some things were easier to learn than others. They found that in the end, it was easy, and they've proved it to the world. Anything to do with science and technology, they may not be quite as creative as others, but they can learn anything that is scientific, or even for that matter, to do with business, finance, economic, entrepreneurial business, no problem at all. They learned that. But some of the political ideas, the very things that you have just mentioned, that Kantian and so on, they were inspired by it. They thought it was marvelous. Idea of freedom, for example, a word which was rarely used in China. I mean, there was among the Taoists and a lot of emphasis on individual freedom. Certainly, the Chinese did have a lot of freedom. They had the freedom to choose to serve or not serve, to do certain things. Nobody really bothered. In the end, if you're restricted in your freedom, it's because of your family within a structure of the family. Nothing political. There's not a political freedom that was so important. It was maybe family, how the head of the family can have absolute right over your life, and and so on. All that was there. But in the end, freedom was tremendously exciting. I mean, when they read the Romantic poets, when they read Goethe and so on, and some of these Ibsen, for example, and they went crazy. And some of the Romantic things of La Bohème and in Paris in the 19th century. They took that very seriously. They're tremendously excited. Freedom. But at the same time, they found that this was also a source of tremendous difficulty. The freedom that they were suddenly fighting for brought them a lot of grief. Civil war, absolute no control whatsoever. The state was weak and divided. Foreigners came in and out without having to say please. All these things adding up to a sense of helplessness and continued poverty, interventions by everybody, almost no say in the country's own development, leading them to, in a way, a very quick disillusionment with what freedom and this democratic process meant. It was such a mess for quite a while. And in the course of that, some of these young people turned, in fact, to the opposite. They turned to the Chinese Communist, to the Communist Party, to the Soviet Union, the Russian Revolution. And in the name of learning from the West, they're now learning from the other West. People forget the West isn't just Western Europe. The West was also to the Chinese. The West was also Eastern Europe. And the Soviet Union was, at that time, a very exciting prospect. Again, brand new ideas, which you haven't heard of before. Communism, socialism, all these were ideas, as you say, ideas. And they were powerful ideas. And they were, in the end, turned out for the Chinese people, much more powerful than the ideas of liberal democracy and capitalism, which in their eyes benefited the rich, the people who knew how to make money, the entrepreneurs, the bankers, financiers, and so on, and maybe even some of the scientists and technologists. But it didn't benefit the 90% peasantry in the country. So when the Mao Zedong came up with a peasant revolution, which rings a bell about peasant rebellions at the past, now it's a peasant revolution using the Marxist-Leninist ideas to start afresh. And of course, there were other factors, much more complicated. But the reality was they succeeded. Their set of ideas actually won in the end and created a world which is totally opposite of the democratic ideals that Kant and all the others in your tradition had brought to China, excited the Chinese, and then more or less found to be inadequate for the needs of the China. And because rooted deep down was this was too foreign for them to accept. What was much more familiar to them was the caring state, a powerful, centralized, caring state that provided peace and harmony, order, and at the same time enable the people to care for the people, to make sure there's distribution, not too much wealth, not too much inequality. All these others were supposed to be provided by this caring state. And that was a tradition. The imperial state was supposed to do that. And the Confucian rhetoric actually provided a lot of the language for that, which now you could merge it with some of the socialistic language of caring and welfare and the state intervening to ensure that people get a fair deal, so to speak. All that now could be merged into the Chinese tradition of a much more authoritarian tradition of nevertheless caring, welfare conscious, distributory kind of state, which to their surprise in today's language also managed to take over capitalism and work it to make capitalism serve this new state. And the state capitalism has, in the eyes of many, many Chinese, surprisingly successful. It has brought about, ended poverty for a lot of people, raised the standard of living in general for most people, not as high as in the West, but pretty high by Chinese standards, very high compared to what they had a few decades ago. So you can see how idealism, the realism now has really taken over. And it is rooted in that Confucian legalist kind of realism, which is powerful laws, but softened by the rhetoric of morality, caring, welfare consciousness, and so on. I think I said I could also go on.
Okay.
Well, Professor Wang, let me just say a few words to you. First of all, thank you for enlightening me. I am not completely ignorant of Chinese thought or Chinese politics, but I wouldn't dare to say very much about it. Your description of Confucius, however, makes me want to go back and read him again, because he sounds exactly like Barack Obama in his new book, which I recommend most highly for anyone who's interested in merging theory and practice, merging morality and practice in politics. It's a brilliant book. So I see there some really deep similarities in your presentation of Confucius. We also have an ends means debate in Western philosophy and politics, going back all the way to Hobbes, but also to the French Revolution. And the idea of the caring state, of course, was so abused by people who insisted on the divine right of kings and so on in Europe, that there was the rebellion against it. What I would, from my really very limited knowledge of Chinese thought, it's certainly clear that Chinese thought places more emphasis on the community than on the individual. Believe me, I'm not happy about the ways in which the emphasis on the individual is abused in certainly contemporary American politics. It's led to simple craziness, like people refusing to wear masks in the middle of a plague, as well as to the total absence of a caring state that offers people something like health insurance or sick leave. I mean, just to talk about things that are very, very problematic in our times. I think, East and West, if we could figure out a way to learn from each other. And by the way, you're in Singapore. I don't know if you know the NUS Yale University in Singapore.
Yeah.
A former student of mine, Amber Carpenter, teaches there, and she's an extremely thoughtful woman who knows Buddhism very well, but also Greek philosophy. You two should meet. I know that is their mission, to bring together Eastern and Western thought. But I will say, because you ended up by talking about communism, I'm not a Marxist. I think Marx made mistakes precisely because he left too much of the Enlightenment out in his work. But I am a socialist. And it's very clear that there's a direct line. I mean, in fact, there were a lot of people around the turn of the last century who understood themselves as Kantian socialists. That is, they accepted and fought for the need for, greater sharing of wealth and equality between peoples and so on and so on. But they wanted to keep alive the moral component of Kantianism, which was already falling behind in various parts of the Kantian philosophy. But I would argue that even communism at its worst, and of course we've seen some, terrible examples of it, even communism at its worst has a kernel of Enlightenment thought in it, although it often betrayed it. So I'm not so sure that East and West are as far apart as people often think.
Okay, great. So it's a good start. Actually, we are already halfway through of the panel discussion. Actually, I should not kind of stay in and let you kind of just interact with each other. It's more exciting. But I'm asked also to watch out some questions from the audience. So I will kind of try to ask. But before that, maybe I have a question, for each of you, for both of you. Do you think, that's related to the main theme of this panel today? It's a compass realism and idealism, right? So I think the main concern of the center, that sponsors, organizes panel is, I think, the conflict between moral ideals and some political realities, right? And a timely example that I'm thinking of is, the current pandemic, right? So we have the virus. Now we also have the vaccine to the virus. Ironically, virus is very fair. It just spreads everywhere without any discrimination, right? But a vaccine is not. Vaccine, we all, according to moral ideals, we think the vaccine should be distributed equally among all nations, among all different kind of peoples, right? Without any discrimination. But the political reality is different because rich countries are hoarding these vaccines with doses, number of doses, multiple times their populations, with nothing or almost nothing left for poor countries, especially those countries that develop and manufacture these vaccines. Perhaps they want to make sure everyone in their own country is vaccinated before they allow a single dose to be shipped out. So here we actually have a conflict. The moral ideals of equal distribution of vaccine and the political reality of every country, my country first, right? So here, I think we have the idealism and the realism, right? So how do we deal with such kind of issue? Do you think, suppose like the United States, of course, Trump will be gone, but not yet. You say American first, right? So we will keep all the vaccine here. No one is allowed to ship any dose out, right? But our moral idea is, but even like when Biden comes to the position, he will face the same problem, right? You have the vaccine. Should you distribute the vaccine equally across the nations, or you want to keep most of them, if not all of them, within the country, right? So I don't know, this is kind of like a particular example, that is related to the issue of moral idealism and political reality. So I think we take this kind of as an example so that each of you can expand to what you have already said. Yeah.
Would Professor Wang like to go first?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
I don't know that I have an answer to this. You described it very accurately. I think that is exactly what all the political leaders have to think about. They may not entirely agree with. They may themselves be willing to share a bit, but they have to consider their own political positions in their own countries and respond. I mean, I'm very struck by the fact that almost every leader says he will do everything he can to make sure that all their people will get the vaccine either sooner or later. Everybody promises that. Now, the reality is, how do you make sure that you get it? I mean, apart from other things, you come back to if a simple basic thing like science and technology. The science and technology involved in carting these, moving these vaccines around is so expensive and so dependent on highly developed skills and technology that it actually costs a lot of money just to ship it, apart from other things. I mean, I was struck when Singapore has announced it, but I noticed from a big table of the countries involved, Singapore is not even in that list, the top 20 countries. Singapore is perfectly capable of paying for everything, but they're not even there because the problem is that it's a tremendous complex operation. And to prepare Changi Airport just to receive the dosages of vaccine, it requires a tremendous effort. And the amount of money they have to invest to try and have the kind of refrigeration possible and all the other. I'm just reading about some of the things to show that this is not entirely a question of idealism now. It seems to me there's also certain things that you can't say, since you can't do it, I'm going to wait for you before I distribute to others. It doesn't, there are all kinds of tremendous pressures on the political leadership. So the very nature of political leadership and responsibility, and you might even say the democratic instincts to fulfill your leadership promises to your people are all in conflict under those circumstances. And there are some real problems about how to ship the stuff around. I mean, I was astonished how some people are really finding difficulty just to get it shipped to their countries.
That's not the case of all the vaccines, by the way. Some of them are very hard to ship. Not all of them are.
Yeah,
I have a couple of things to say about your very good question, Professor Yong. First of all, the ideal thing is we have a pretty clear sense of what the priorities should be internationally. Health workers should get it first. You can go down the list. People pretty much agree that there is priorities. There are people who are under stronger risk. There are also the people who keep our grocery chains going for those of us who are privileged enough to work at home, and they should get it before I do, for example, So I think it's pretty clear. I think ideally those standards should be applied internationally. Professor Wang has pointed out, of course, that political leaders do have a responsibility to their own constituents that could get in the way. I can say it will sound funny, but it's actually true. I fear there will be extra doses available in the United States because the anti-vaccine and the anti-corona propaganda is so broad that at the moment, half of all Americans say they're not going to take it. So, there may be extra in the United States. But more important is this fact, and I'd really like to emphasize it because I think it's a nice example of a blend of both idealism and realism. One of my closest friends is a world-renowned historian of science. And we were sitting together before the lockdown when we could actually meet and have coffee together, not on Zoom. And she was very, very pessimistic about the time it would take to develop a vaccine. And she was talking about the history of medicine, and she was telling me, she knows her stuff. How long it takes to get, how people are happy to get a 50 or 60% success rate, and so on and so on. That was the end of September. Now, she is qualified to read all the data in a way that I'm not qualified. I'm not a natural scientist. And she said, this is really incredible. And we were talking about it. When the world economy is sufficiently threatened by a problem, people find the money to fix it. It is an extraordinary feat. That I agree distribution still hasn't all been settled, but according to historians of science, this is a first that so many different researchers in so many places have been given the funds to develop that. Now think about what we could do if we learn a lesson from this. And this is my favorite other fact that I just tell people because I don't know what to do with it, but I think if enough people did, we might be able to do something about it. Everybody knows of Malala Yousafzai. She was the youngest Nobel laureate. And they know that she won her prize for fighting for the right of girls to get an education. What much fewer people know is now that she's at Oxford getting her education, she gave a speech to the UN in which she said that it would be possible to give every child in the world 12 years of a good education on the military spending that is spent in 8 days a year. 8 days a year. And it so happened that after I read that, I had a meeting, I mean, in a completely another thing, with a Nobel laureate in economics. And I asked him, I said, can this be true? Can you know, is this possible? And he took out a piece of paper and he did some figures. And he said, yeah, that's about right. 8 days of military spending.
Yeah.
So, you know, the resources are there to deal with the climate crisis, with poverty, with educational problems, with health problems. If we as a world could unite and do something about the outrageous focus on military resources and turn them to problems that need to be solved. And I think the corona vaccine should be used as an example that that's possible.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe like you know, I kind of like a little bit kind of push it further. Professor Neiman, you are right. You know, like suppose you know United States will have the actual vaccine, but the problem is this: like even half of the U.S. population will not get, you know, be willing to get vaccinated. You still need to have at least, I think, 6 months for them to produce enough, right? So that means during this 6 months, other countries, poor countries, right, they do not have the money to order, or even if they have money because, you know, United States want to kind of vaccinize their own citizens first. So before the end of June, for example, you have to wait, right? So the question is, you know, they you know, from the moral ideal, you know, why these poor countries, you know, have the lowest priority, right? So this kind of reminds me of one idea, and I want to kind of ask you, both of you. I think, you know, Professor Wang, of course, knows that, and Professor Neiman certainly also knows that, like Confucian idea of love with distinction, right? You love your family members more than strangers, right? And so you kind of extend it. You love your fellow citizens more than citizens of other countries, right? So I think that can be justified from Confucian idea. But from Kantian idea, like Professor Neiman just talked about, right? Everybody is equal, regardless, you know, which country you're from, or which you can, or you can, okay. So I just try to see whether this Confucian idea can be justified. If Confucian idea, now of course, Confucian idea is certainly, I think, not that, okay, I just love my own country, I don't love other countries. You still need to love them, but not, you know, as the same, right? So maybe like the United States, suppose they, I just use the example, keeps like 70% of a vaccine for their own country and ship 30% at the same time, not wait until they finish their job in the country, right? So at the same time, like you ship 30% of the vaccine outside. And in this case, you still put your own citizen like at first. But I think like perhaps the United States, what the United States will do, they will not like 70%, they 100% for their own people, right? And only afterwards they will ship out. So like, yeah.
May I answer? Because you're asking an important question, but I think it's based on a false premise. I believe it was the Chinese philosopher Mencius who talked about the urge that you would have if you walked by and saw a strange child drowning in a well, that people would have the impulse to jump in and save the child. But of course, it is natural. If there were 2 children drowning, I would save my own child first. Of course I would. All right. But the argument that there's a contradiction between that principle and distributing healthcare equally presumes scarce resources. And the reason I brought in the Malala example is to say that the resources are really not as scarce as we say. as we think, or, or as frankly, neoliberal capitalism keeps telling us. If we would stop spending the amount that we spend yearly on arms to kill each other, and instead of that, spend it on healthcare, education, and a more equal distribution of resources, the money's all there. Okay, so I mean, I'm just saying. Of course, you're right that at this moment, it's not going to be distributed fairly because we live in a world where wealthy countries have, more power than poorer countries. But the wealthy powers maintain that power by telling us lies about scarce resources and forgetting to think that there might be other alternatives.
Professor Wang, you want to say
No,
something?
I totally agree. I can't think of any other way of describing it, because it does seem to me that ultimately we come down, I'm afraid, to your first point right at the beginning. Having ideas is fine, but ideas may take a long time and have to overcome a lot of realities before they bears fruit, so to speak. But in the meantime, reality surrounds us and actively imposes its will on us, as it were, every moment of the time. And this discrepancy between the vision and long-term development of a beautiful idea that one day will come to fruition, and the day-to-day problems met by people and their leaders and your soldiers, your army, your capitalists, your financial, your bankers, all the people concerned, that day-to-day reality just takes over and just dominates everybody's actions and decisions and thought.
Professor Wang, I mentioned two major changes that I have seen in my own lifetime, and I'm a bit younger than you are, so I assume you can also look back. Even in one lifetime, you mentioned fighting poverty in so much of China, where China was seen as a hopelessly poor case. I'm not keen on many of the things that I read about that are going on in contemporary China, but I admire the ways in which people who were hopelessly poor now have a decent standard of living. I see us all in a situation of carrying torches that get passed on to the next generation. And people are so willing to talk about all the ideals that have not been fulfilled, that I've kind of made it a habit to talk about those that have been, not because I don't see the problems, I do, but because I think we are tempted to lose hope and tempted to resign when we don't see clear examples of progress. And I'll tell you one little piece of hope that I have, although I'm not 100% sure about it. In the face of the climate crisis, I just happen to know from the circle at Davos. I have never been to Davos. It's really not my crowd, but I know some people who are in the inner circle, that they are worried. And they are worried not just about the climate crisis, they're worried about social unrest that inequality will bring in the face of, the continued climate crisis. So those people who do have economic power and thereby political power do think about these things at the moment. It may sound too idealistic, but I don't know what else we can do. And the thinker Noam Chomsky has said this also. The climate crisis is so severe and threatens us so much that there is the chance that the world will come together in order to fight it, and that in coming together, we would also have to fight, sort of runaway consumption and runaway inequality. And it could destroy us, but it could also bring us together.
Okay, so like time goes by very quickly. So I think there are quite a few questions in the audience. So maybe like I pick some questions. Although the questions are very like one sentence, I wish they can explain it a little bit. But like one question, I think it may be directed to Professor Wang. Is talking about the role of women. How does one reconcile it with Confucianism in the modern context? So
one of the most amazing things is that for the Chinese people, it took the Chinese people a long time, even in modern times, to reject the Confucian lack of interest in women's rights, which is so obvious. And I know many young women today would say totally reject anything to do with Confucius on that point alone. But in the 1920s and 30s, the women were aware of it, and the men were aware of it, and they recognized that Confucius had not paid any attention to women's rights. In fact, if anything, he was always couching mother's rights, and the mother had rights. But apart from the mother, because of the filial piety, and that was part of his operational code, as it were. But apart from that, women were just not part of the bargain. I mean, the kind of extended families that the literati and the mandarins had created for themselves hardly mentioned the women. And as you know, in the genealogies, you don't even mention the daughters' names because you're marrying them off to some other family who keep their genealogy. And their genealogy doesn't mention her either because she's not one of their family. So that had been going on for 2,000 years. And how the women had put up with that for all that time, well, that's a story by itself, and one can go into that in a big way. But even after the ideas came and were so appealing to the women, it was still so hard. Until this day, for all the tremendous success with anti-poverty and so on, they haven't done all that well about women's position in China. I mean, they make, as you see, there are selective areas where you make progress. And this has something to do, is rooted in your heritage, in some of the values that you carry from the past. Deep down, after 2,000 or 3,000 years, it really is so deep that trying to change that, it does in fact take a long time. I mean, I'm optimistic enough to believe it will come, but I must say, observing my mother or my grandmother and seeing how they went through it all, and watching the position of women in East Asia in general, not only China, it's a long, long ride. So I do share your hope that in some areas things might move faster and so on. And interestingly, I think this will be in the areas where you can do it through science and technology, and or even the use of economic finance, banking, some of that very hard-headed practical side of it, very realistic, and drawing upon your science and technology. That is something you can move very fast. But when it comes to inherited values, particularly moral values, I hate to say, particularly moral values and values about how social behavior, social relationships, and so on, that, in my experience, you asked about my age, I haven't had long innings, and I must say the progress has not been all that impressive.
So I think maybe I also pick one question from the audience for Professor Neiman, and then perhaps it's about the time for us to conclude the panel. The question is not kind of directed to Professor Neiman, but I think Professor Neiman can answer this question. I think it'd be better. So what are the dangers of extreme realism? In your opinion, shall we counter extreme realism? How?
We should counter extreme realism precisely by focusing on the cases where ideals have changed the world. And I'm sorry, Professor Wang hasn't seen enough change in his own part of the world. I think I've seen some more. I talked about fights against racism, which of course still exists, and exists in the United States. We've seen that Black people are murdered by police, even though we had a splendid African-American president, but it was still progress. We just need to make more. And I think the reason why it's important to keep examples of progress before our eyes is that if we don't have them, we won't be motivated to keep working towards more. If we only focus on the ways that we've failed, frankly, we will just throw up our hands, have another drink, or whatever people do to kind of, tune out of the world and stop trying. And that is exactly what people who call them, let's just say the powers that be, who actually don't want anything changed, that's exactly what they want us to do. My next book, well, maybe it's my next book but one, is actually going to be on heroism. And I wrote a little bit about that in my book, Moral Clarity, but I want to expand on that because I think it's very important to keep heroes in front of our eyes. I'm quite sure that everybody who thinks about it will find their own heroes. Often they're not famous, but they're people who, risked something, not necessarily their life. I'm not talking about martyrs, by the way. There's a difference between heroes and martyrs. But people who took risks to move the world forward in their corner of it in some way. And that is what I would advise everybody to do. Find those people and keep them in mind.
Thank you.
And become one yourself, of course. That's the idea.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Professor Wang and Professor Neiman, for this interesting discussion. If time permits, we can certainly go on and have a lot of things to discuss. But now I turn to Director Alice Wang. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Huang. Thank you, Professor Wang and Professor Neiman. I thoroughly enjoy the discussion, and I have taken so much from this. I totally agree. I did finish President Obama's book just last weekend, so I totally agree with Professor Neiman there. But I also want to thank all three of you to talk about. It's ideas. I really do think ideas matter. And times like this, I look at our own Asia Society Hong Kong in February of this year. We were ready to throw our hands up and not do anything because a lot of time the center was closed and we could easily just sit on our hands. But my team and I, we started our COVID update. And I'm happy to report since February, Asia Society Hong Kong's viewership have never been better. And it's the reality. We took action, and I count myself the heroes of Hong Kong were the healthcare workers and the professors at CUHK, Hong Kong U, to learn about COVID directly from them. And so I totally agree with Professor Neiman, the heroes. Sometimes it's not hero with a capital H, but it's heroes, people who live among us. And I have seen it this year with the COVID-19. I see it in our team, and I see it in our members, and I see it in just little kindness. And so in some ways, I've been very depressed because the center, again, it's closed, and we're probably likely closed for another until end of the year. But it's not a total loss. And my philosophy has been, when life throws you lemon, make lemonade. And this year we have made better lemonade than ever. And we ended up doing a count recently. Previously, we had 15,000 last year because of the social unrest. We had 15,000 visitors to Asia Society Hong Kong. This year, thanks to social media and technology and to speakers like all tonight, we were able to attract over 400,000 viewers to Asia Society Hong Kong. I think Professor Wang knows our history. We've only been around for 30 years, but we have hopefully made an impact, and we'll continue our COVID series, and we'll continue programs like tonight. And it's really important that we keep thinking and we keep acting. Idealism does matter. Realism does matter. The real reality is we are close. Reality is COVID is among us. Reality is we won't get our vaccine for another 6 months, some of us, or longer. But in the meantime, we have a brain, and we are thinking, and we are talking. And that's another reason we are here. Again, one of our motto, we shed light, not heat, and it's discussions like tonight. I want to thank all three of you for this discussion, and I look forward to welcome all of you back. I know Professor Neiman's next book, please come back and tell us about the heroes, and also Professor Wang's book. I'm as a Chinese American, as a Chinese diaspora, your writing have really inspired many of us. So please come back and tell us about your book that you have co-written with your wife. And I look forward to having Professor Huang. You're in our backyard, but you still haven't been to see us. When COVID is over, I look forward to welcome you all to the center in person. Or if not, we can continue the ideas going online like tonight. And so good night. And I want to thank our audience for joining us tonight. And I want to thank again our global audience. I know we have them. And I want to thank our three wonderful speakers. Good night.
May I just thank you?
Yeah,
First of all, I've learned a great deal from this conversation and enjoyed it very much. Secondly, you might be interested that my institute, the Einstein Forum, has actually had a similar experience with Zoom. So it's interesting. And thirdly, I want to thank all the heroes in Hong Kong.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I want to second all of that. And I again look forward to seeing all of you online, and have a wonderful day, and stay healthy and stay vigilant. This COVID is still with us, and I think we really need to keep an eye on it. And the vaccine is here. Light is at the end, but we're not over yet. And that's just the reality. Good night.
Good night. Thank you.
Very
Bye.
much. Thank you very much. Nice to meet you.